Imagine taking the one product that made your company a global household name for, what, 70 years, and just ripping it completely out of your business model.
Yeah, just completely selling it off.
Exactly. Selling it off.
Yeah.
I mean, that is what Olympus did. They didn't just pivot. They practically amputated their iconic camera division.
Yeah, the very thing people associate with their logo.
Yeah. To bet their entire corporate future on, well, the inside of the human stomach.
It is the absolute definition of a structural overhaul. And honestly, from a corporate strategy standpoint, it is incredibly risky.
Well, for sure.
You're shedding this massive revenue stream for a highly specialized focus.
And that risk is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to our deep dive on the Japan Stock Podcast.
Glad to be here.
Our mission today for you listening is to extract the key drivers impacting the earnings, the growth, and really the sheer future viability of Olympus.
Right.
And to do that, we've brought a massive stack of sources to the table. We are looking at their integrated reports, some pretty dense financial presentations, and pages of executive Q&A transcripts.
Yeah, we're basically going to see what happens when a legacy manufacturer tries to just completely rewire its own DNA.
Exactly. And context is everything here. Because for you listening, if you hear the name Olympus, your brain probably still pictures those, sleek digital cameras.
Or maybe the high-end scientific microscopes.
Right. That's a perfectly natural association given their history. But the reality check we have to start with is that this is no longer who they are.
Not at all.
They have entirely shed that consumer imaging division. And just recently, they also sold off their highly respected scientific division, Evident.
Which is a huge move. They've completely stripped away those non-core assets to become a pure-play global medical technology company.
Right, and not just a generic MedTech player. I mean, we are talking about the giant that literally pioneered the practical gastrocamera way back in, 1950?
1950, yeah. Which brings us to their current structure. Today, they're essentially split into two main arteries.
Okay.
You've got the Endoscopic Solutions Division and the Therapeutic Solutions Division.
Though if you look at their forward guidance, they are actually reorganizing those, right?
Yes, exactly. They're shifting into gastrointestinal and surgical intervention divisions by April 2025.
So they are getting even more specific.
Yeah, and it is crucial to understand the fundamental why behind this pruning process. It wasn't just a financial play to, dump unprofitable segments.
Right.
By shedding legacy assets, management has aligned the entire corporate identity around a single unified purpose. They state it explicitly in their reports.
Which is making people's lives healthier, safer, and more fulfilling.
Exactly. They're focusing their entire R&D and capital entirely on early diagnosis and minimally invasive treatments.
Which sets the stage for this massive internal overhaul they call Transform Olympus. Because you don't just change your entire business model without, changing how the company actually operates.
You really can't.
Starting in 2019, they launched over 1,000 bottom-up initiatives across every function and region.
And bottom-up is the key phrase there. This wasn't just executives in Tokyo decreeing a 10% headcount reduction from the top down.
Right. It wasn't just a spreadsheet exercise.
Exactly. This was ground-level operational restructuring. We're talking about factory workers identifying supply chain redundancies or standardizing microscopic parts across different endoscope models to save manufacturing costs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and even consolidating disparate regional sales teams into a unified global force.
And the financial payoff from those 1,000 micro-adjustments was, staggering. According to the data, their adjusted operating margin leaped from 9.2% in fiscal year 2019 to 19.3% by fiscal year 2022.
Which is huge.
Yeah. A 10% margin jump in just 3 years for a legacy manufacturer is massive. But looking at the sheer scale of that disruption, I have to ask, was it actually a smooth ride? Because on paper, that sounds like renovating a house while you were still living inside it.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. And the short answer is no, it wasn't smooth at all.
I figured.
The transformation boosted baseline profitability, sure. But if we look at the most recent data, we get a pretty severe reality check. Take their third quarter for fiscal year 2024.
No?
On the surface, they hit a record high total profit of 252 billion yen, with earnings per share sitting at 208 yen.
Wait, a quarter of a trillion yen in profit? That sounds like an absolute victory lap for the management team.
It does, right. Until you read the fine print in the financial presentation.
There's always fine print.
Always. A massive chunk of that 252 billion yen was a one-time gain from divesting that scientific business, evident.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so if you strip that away and look under the hood at the actual operational environment, they were fighting severe headwinds on almost every single front.
Right, because the real world doesn't just pause while you restructure your business.
Precisely. First, there was the devastating Noto Peninsula earthquake in Japan. That caused a temporary sales hit of about 24 billion yen due to operational halts.
Well,
Add to that the broader macro issues. You've got global inflation driving up material costs and ongoing supply chain bottlenecks that delayed shipping.
right.
And then the real operational kicker, a 50 billion yen provision for the autonomous recall of their small bowel endoscopes.
50 billion yen for a recall. That is not a small speed bump. That is a massive hit to the balance sheet.
It really is.
And the fact that it was autonomous, meaning, they caught it and initiated it themselves rather than being forced by regulators, shows they're taking quality seriously. But it still burns a massive hole in the quarter's earnings.
It absolutely does. It shows that the margin expansion from the Transform Olympus era was structurally real, but the environment they are operating in right now is incredibly turbulent,
Right.
and their margin for error is shrinking rapidly.
But this is where the story gets really compelling. Because despite those operational shocks and despite the recall, they're sitting on what looks like a generational growth engine. Let's dig into the EVI's X1. This is their next generation endoscope system. And looking at the market data here, the potential is just staggering. They're looking at a 70,000 unit replacement potential globally.
And that volume is largely driven by hospitals and clinics finally upgrading from their older legacy system.
The older models, right?
Yeah, primarily the CV190 and 290 series, which have been workhorses for years. Olympus is projecting a 7.4% 5-year compound annual growth rate, or CAGR, just for this system.
And that growth rate isn't just a hopeful projection, right? It's already playing out.
It is.
In the regions where the EVS X1 has been introduced since fiscal year 2021, which includes Europe, Japan, and parts of the Asia-Pacific, it already makes up somewhere between 11 to 19% of their total gastrointestinal endoscope sales.
The adoption rate is remarkable. It is undeniably a super cycle for their core business.
Okay, but we need to talk about why hospitals are rushing to buy this thing. I mean, we can throw numbers around all day, but what is the actual mechanism driving this demand?
Good question.
What does the EVIS X1 do that the old models don't?
It comes down to a proprietary technology called NBI, or narrowband imaging.
Okay, NBI.
Right. And to understand why this is revolutionary, you have to understand how difficult it is to spot early-stage cancer. In a standard white light endoscopy, everything inside the stomach or colon just looks pink and uniform.
Right, it all blends together.
Exactly. It is incredibly hard to spot a precancerous lesion before it actually forms a protruding tumor.
So it's like trying to find a specific pink thread in a massive pile of pink fabric.
That is a great visual, yeah. So what narrowband imaging does is filter out all that standard white light,
Okay.
and it only emits very specific wavelengths of blue and green light. These specific wavelengths are strongly absorbed by hemoglobin in the blood.
Oh, wow. So instead of a wash of pink, the blood vessels suddenly stand out.
Exactly. The tiny capillaries and vascular structures on the very surface of the tissue pop out in stark, dark contrast.
That's incredible.
And since tumors require a massive network of blood vessels to grow, doctors can literally see the abnormal vascular changes of early-stage cancer before the tumor itself even has a chance to fully develop.
That level of clinical outcome is exactly why hospitals are willing to spend millions upgrading to this system.
It's a lifesaver, literally.
That is a phenomenal technological moat.
Yeah.
So the product is a clear hit. Europe has it. Japan has it. It's saving lives. But what about the U.S.? Because the U.S. market is usually the undisputed crown jewel for MedTech, representing the highest margins and the largest volume. But according to these integrated reports, the U.S. rollout for the EVS X1 was severely delayed.
Very delayed.
Pushed all the way back to mid-fiscal year 2024. Why was the biggest market left waiting?
3 letters. FDA.
Wait, delayed, let me guess, regulatory friction in the U.S.?
And not just friction, a full stop. In fiscal year 2023, Olympus received 3 warning letters from the FDA.
3. One warning letter is usually enough to send a corporate boardroom into a cold sweat and crater a stock price. Getting 3 means there is a systemic issue.
It was a massive red flag. The FDA pointed out severe deficiencies in product labeling and Honestly, more importantly, in process validation.
Okay, let's unpack process validation for the listener. In MedTech, that doesn't just mean testing the final camera to see if it turns on, right?
Far from it. Process validation means you have to prove mathematically and scientifically that your manufacturing process will produce the exact same required result every single time.
Right.
It means proving that the torque on a microscopic screw will be identical on the next 10,000 units you build.
Wow.
Yeah. So to get the EVI X1 approved for the U.S. market, Olympus had to sit down with the FDA and agree on exactly how every single module and manufacturing step would be validated.
So how did management react to that? Because, the standard corporate playbook here is to hire an expensive consulting firm, apply a quick patch to the specific factory the FDA flagged, submit the paperwork, and just get back to selling as fast as possible.
And that is exactly what makes this case study so fascinating. Olympus didn't just apply a patch.
They didn't.
No. They treated those warning letters as an existential wake-up call. They publicly halted, took a brutal look at their internal operations, and launched a massive, comprehensive quality transformation program called Elevate.
Elevate. Okay, so
Yes.
this goes beyond just fixing the paperwork for those three letters.
Vastly beyond. Elevate is a complete cultural and operational overhaul of their quality assurance and regulatory affairs, or QARA.
QARA, got it.
They are rebuilding their compliance processes across manufacturing and R&D globally, not just in the U.S.
That's a huge undertaking.
Right. They are retraining staff, ripping out old legacy software systems, and basically building a unified quality control infrastructure from the ground up.
But doing a global rebuild of your quality assurance, that has to cost an absolute fortune.
And that is the critical financial link we need to make today. This massive QARA investment is incredibly expensive. It is the primary reason their operating margins are being intentionally depressed right now, with forecasts adjusting down to 15.7% or 16.2% recently.
Hold on. You're telling me a CEO looked at activist investors who just cheered as the company got lean and mean, who celebrated that 19.3% margin during the Transform Olympus era,
Yeah.
and said, hey, we're actually going to tank our margins for the next 3 years to do regulatory paperwork. Wall Street usually punishes that kind of long-term thinking ruthlessly. How did the stock not completely crater?
It requires an immense amount of communication and discipline from leadership. They really had to convince the market that if they don't have absolute, unquestionable quality and regulatory compliance, their long-term guidance is simply impossible.
And their guidance is ambitious. Right?
Exactly. They're targeting an 8% EPS compound annual growth rate and a sustained 20% operating margin. You can't hit that with a broken foundation.
It's the house analogy again, but this time it's the foundation. You realize the wiring inside the walls isn't up to code. You could just put a piece of electrical tape over the one exposed wire the FDA inspector found.
Right.
Or you can rip open the drywall and rewire the entire house so it doesn't burn down in 10 years. And they chose to rip open the drywall.
That is the perfect way to frame it. It is deliberate, short-term financial pain for long-term existential security.
So the U.S. market is currently bogged down by this massive, expensive regulatory rebuild. If you're Olympus and your traditional cash cow market is moving slowly while you fix the foundation, where do you look to make up that growth?
You look for scale.
Exactly. You look for a market with massive scale, an aging population, and a government practically throwing money at healthcare infrastructure. You look at China.
And according to our sources, China currently represents about 13% of Olympus's GI sales. And the macroeconomic fundamentals there are incredibly strong for this specific sector.
Yeah, the numbers are wild.
We are looking at a historic average of 5% GDP growth, paired with an 11% growth in national health expenditure.
Because the Chinese government is actively pushing to modernize its healthcare infrastructure, right? Particularly shifting investments toward mid-level and regional hospitals.
Yes.
They're trying to fix the severe medical disparity between the rural provinces and the massive top-tier city hospitals in places like Shanghai or Beijing.
They are pouring billions into equipping these regional hospitals, but there is a massive operational bottleneck that money alone cannot solve.
And this statistic from the reports absolutely blew my mind.
Oh, the endoscopist numbers.
Yes. When it comes to endoscopist, the actual doctors trained to navigate these highly technical cameras inside a patient. China only has 2.8 of them per 100,000 people.
That's incredibly low.
To give you listening some context on how low that is, Japan has 28.2 per 100,000 people.
It is a tenfold difference in human capital.
Right. So it doesn't matter how incredible the EVUS X1 NBI technology is, or how much money the Chinese government wants to spend on upgrading regional hospitals.
Hmm.
If there are no doctors trained to hold the scope, you cannot sell the equipment.
Exactly.
It's like building millions of miles of state-of-the-art high-speed rail, but realizing you have zero engineers trained to drive the trains. So how is a Japanese MedTech company solving a literal human resource shortage at a national level in China?
This is where we see Olympus acting as much more than just a hardware vendor. They realized they couldn't just ship boxes of cameras to regional hospitals and wish them good luck.
Right.
They have deeply and deliberately embedded themselves into the Chinese medical infrastructure. They currently operate 7 service centers across the region, which is industry leading.
Yep.
But more importantly, they run highly specialized training centers to actively teach the local doctors.
So they're essentially building their own future customer base by subsidizing the education of the market.
It is a brilliant long-term play. By teaching these doctors how to perform minimally invasive surgeries and early diagnostics using Olympus equipment specifically, they're creating a structural, career-long dependency on their ecosystem.
Oh, that makes total sense. Once a surgeon learns the muscle memory of an Olympus scope, they rarely want to switch brands.
Exactly. The switching costs for the surgeon's own skill set become too high.
But operating in China isn't just a straight line to profits. The transcripts highlight some severe macro risks. We have to talk about the VBP program, volume-based procurement.
Right, VBP.
For the listener, VBP is basically the Chinese government leveraging its massive size to aggressively drive down medical costs. It's essentially a brutal reverse auction.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it.
The government puts 10 medical device manufacturers in a room and says, hey, whoever bids the absolute lowest price gets 80% of the national market. Everyone else gets nothing. Doesn't a system designed to crush profit margins directly threaten a premium foreign manufacturer like Olympus?
It is a very real structural threat to their pricing power. However, if we connect this back to the technological moat we discussed earlier, Olympus currently has a distinct advantage.
Okay.
Yes, local procurement guidelines have been heavily favoring domestic, cheaper products. But Olympus's main GI endoscopes have largely remained exempt from these aggressive VBP cost-cutting targets.
Wait, why do they get a pass on the reverse auction?
Because right now, there simply are no local Chinese products that can match their clinical outcomes. Remember that NBI technology we talked about?
The blue and green light.
Exactly. It has essentially become the clinical standard for early cancer diagnosis and endoscopy. The government wants cheaper equipment, absolutely. But they cannot afford to compromise the quality of national cancer diagnostics when no local alternative exists that can see those precancerous blood vessels.
Okay, so their elite technology saves them from being immediately swapped out for a cheaper generic brand. But management isn't just resting on that technological lead, are they? Because eventually, local competitors will catch up.
No, they are highly aware of that ticking clock, and they are taking a very shrewd strategic mitigation step.
What's that?
To align with the government's aggressive push for domestic manufacturing, Olympus is building a brand new manufacturing facility in Suzhou.
Ah, so they can literally slap a Made in China sticker on their proprietary tech.
Exactly. By localizing production, they bypass the stigma and tariffs associated with foreign imports, align themselves with national policy, and maintain their proprietary quality control. It secures their foothold.
However, the Q&A transcripts do note a very recent sharp, short-term headwind in that market. A widespread anti-corruption campaign sweeping through the Chinese medical sector caused a significant delay in hospital bidding processes during fiscal year 2024.
Yes. The government began heavily auditing hospital administrators for accepting kickbacks from equipment vendors.
Right.
As a result, hospitals essentially froze all their purchasing out of fear while the audits were happening.
Which hits Olympus's bottom line immediately, even if the fundamental long-term demand for endoscopes hasn't changed. So what does this all mean for you listening? Especially if you are an analyst or an investor evaluating the case for a company navigating these kinds of turbulent waters.
It's a lot to weigh.
We have a company that successfully transformed its historical margins, is sitting on a highly lucrative life-saving product cycle, but is heavily bogged down by expensive U.S. FDA compliance and complex, shifting Chinese market dynamics. What is the ultimate mindset of the management team right now?
This is where leadership is being severely tested. The stock market, by its very nature, is impatient and demands instant gratification.
Always.
Investors look at a company that just achieved a near 20% margin, that just brought in billions from selling off major assets like Evident, and they inevitably say, great job. Now where is my massive dividend payout?
Right, where are the aggressive share buybacks?
Exactly. They want the cash returned to them immediately.
But the new CEO has delivered a very explicit, disciplined, and frankly brave message regarding capital allocation. For the next 2 to 3 years, management is intentionally prioritizing heavy investments in the Elevate KRA transformation over short-term shareholder returns.
Which is a remarkably tough pill to force down the throat of a market that loves quarterly earnings beats.
It really is.
But the CEO's rationale, as outlined in these reports, is incredibly sound. He argues that the market currently places high valuations on Olympus's projected growth over the next decade.
Right.
But realistically, without focusing capital entirely on the carryover transformation and fixing the regulatory foundation, that future growth is just a house of cards.
It'll collapse.
Exactly. The CEO firmly believes that achieving their strategic financial guidance by actually fixing their core quality culture will ultimately provide a much higher, more sustainable compound return to shareholders than simply artificially bumping up the dividend today.
It's the ultimate public test of short-term pain for long-term gain. They are betting that a fortress-like regulatory and quality foundation is vastly more valuable than a temporary spike in the stock price driven by a buyback program.
And historically speaking, in the highly regulated medical technology space, where a single major product recall or FDA ban can permanently devastate a brand's reputation and market share, prioritizing compliance is usually the correct, albeit painful, bet.
Okay, let's bring this all together. We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We watched Olympus successfully transform its baseline profitability, shedding its legacy camera and scientific businesses to become a highly focused, pure-play MedTech giant.
Yep.
We looked at the massive clinical and financial potential of the EVIS X1 supercycle and its NBI technology, but we also saw the brutal reality of the next 1 to 3 years.
Heavy lifting phase.
Right. Their ultimate success hinges entirely on their ability to execute the Elevate quality overhaul under the intense, unforgiving scrutiny of the FDA, while simultaneously navigating the high-reward, highly complex environment of China.
It is an incredibly delicate operational balancing act. They undeniably have the technology, they have the market demand, and they have the vision.
Yeah.
But execution on unglamorous things like compliance, process validation, and localization will dictate their future valuation.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to chew on as we wrap up.
Hmm.
We started this deep dive talking about a company willingly ripping out its own foundation.
We did.
A global giant, a company that literally invented the modern gastrocamera, is willing to publicly halt its financial victory lap, to look impatient investors in the eye and say, we are stopping everything to completely rebuild our internal quality culture from the ground up. How should that change the way you evaluate the true health of the companies you invest in?
It really challenges us to look past the shiny quarterly earnings beats and critically examine the structural integrity of the business itself. High margins are great, but are they sustainable if the foundation is rotting?
Exactly. Next time you look at a company's earnings report, it's worth asking, are their margins high because they are brilliantly innovating, or are they high because they are dangerously deferring maintenance on their own foundation?
That's the real question.
Because sometimes the absolute healthiest thing a company could do is admit its foundation needs fixing.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.